start with the first session right now. The topic is Evolving Trends in Global Taxation. The increase in the OECD two-pillar solution enrollments signals approval of global tax reform proposals. Simultaneously, the United Nations efforts to address digital economy, taxation, and equitable distribution of taxing rights aim to safeguard developing countries' needs. We are pleased to deliberate on evolving trends in global taxation. Please join the bandwagon in witnessing a stellar panel chaired by Dr. Virendrajit Singh, who's a member of the IBFD Board of Trustees and led by Mr. Dinesh Kanabar. Mr. Singh, I'd like to invite you to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. And in order to ensure we proceed quickly, I would like to invite all members of the panel and the speaker, Mr. Dinesh Kanabar, Ms. Yvette, Mr. Rasmi Ranjan, and Professor Annette Ogotu to please come up and take your seats. So first of all, my welcome to all of you to this FIT IBFD International Taxation Conference. I have been involved in this many, many years ago, and then I'm back now in Mumbai. And previously when Professor Roy Rohatgi was very involved in the program as well. Now, as you know, the theme of this particular conference is reshaping the international tax architecture in an era of multilateralism. So the topic for this particular session is on evolving trends in global taxation. So what I will do is talk a little bit about some of the trends that we see happening in the world of taxation. And I know Michael Leonard will take serious note of it, I hope. And so will everyone else. And I will highlight some of this before our panel then moves into their discussion. So as we all know, there are a number of trends. Some of them are very new. Some of them have been there for a long while. Let me outline some of this. The tax landscape in the digital age, that to me is a very important trend that continues to evolve. We are seeing tremendous change in the technological adoption of various innovations in taxation. And we all know that this impacts both tax administrators as well as taxpayers. So the question here is, where is all this heading? Be it in respect of the taxation of the metaverse, the issue of the digital nomad, as well as the future direction of tax administrations. Many of you would know of electronic invoicing or e-invoicing that is being adopted by many tax administrations around the world. At the same time, tax compliance costs also keep increasing. And in fact, in some countries, what adds to the burden is the fact that some jurisdictions do not allow a full tax deduction for some of these specific tax compliance costs. The second major thing that I would like to outline is this aspect of climate change and how taxation is applicable in terms of mitigating the various issues that we face. So how can tax policy assist in mitigating the possible crisis that is oncoming? And does this mean that carbon taxes are essential in all jurisdictions? Or are there other tax policy options that one can implement? Again, there is no one formula that can be applied. And we need to look at the economic structure of a jurisdiction before we can decide which tax policy option applies to a particular jurisdiction. The third topic that I think is of relevance is this concept of public trust and ethics in tax. So how can ethics be further enhanced in the world that is evolving and ever challenging? And some of you may be aware that those of us who are in the accounting profession, the International Federation of Accountants, as well as the OECD, have had a number of sessions on this topic of public trust in tax. And the concept of tax morale has been raised many times and has been discussed. And I believe this will continue to be an ongoing issue, and research on this topic will continue to evolve. And some of us are aware of some of the issues that have been faced by large some large accounting firms in terms of the challenges that the governments have put on them in terms of some of the information that may have been leaked out and disclosed. Next, international developments in cross-border taxation, and that's fundamentally what many of us are engaged in. And by this, we refer to the international tax framework that all of us are trying to work on, the Pillar 1, Pillar 2 developments, the work of the OECD, the work of the UN, and the question of where is all of this heading towards. Now, so the question is, are we on a long and winding road in this area of trying to forge together a solid international tax framework? Or will all this be resolved quickly? Now, I would not hold my breath on this, but I am clearly supportive of a win-win solution. And I think that's where the challenge is in terms of how the international framework will be crafted out. Now, given all these developments, the other key issue is about tax dispute resolution. How will the tax dispute resolution process take shape? Because there will be international issues, there are already international issues, and this requires greater cohesion and maturity to prevail amongst all parties. And so, if we ever were to arrive at a comprehensive international tax framework, we will then need a robust tax dispute resolution process to be in place. The next aspect is about this concept, which is very basic. Complexity is real. So how does this impact tax decision making? Whether it's in terms of taxpayers, corporates, as well as tax administrators in some cases in the developing countries. Is there a need to have a rethink of all that has been developed and is developing? And sometimes you step back and think about this and say, what has happened to simplification as one of the key tenets of tax policy that many of us have been brought up on? And finally, based on what I've just outlined and what the panel will obviously discuss, I believe there's a need to start discussing about the possibility of a multilateral organization to manage these various international tax matters and issues that have just been mentioned and will be discussed further in depth. And in particular, what I'm alluding to is the question of whether a world tax organization is becoming a reality in the near future, in the context of everything that we talk about. Now, these trends that I've just outlined very quickly, I think will certainly resonate with many of us. And we will see in some way or other, this will also be touched on in all the other sessions that we'll have at this conference today and tomorrow. I think it cuts through all the topics that we have. So what we'll do now is to actually have a presentation, after which we'll have a panel discussion. The presentation will be done by Ms. Yvette Wakabi. She will take about 20 minutes to present her views on the key trends and set the stage. And then Mr. Dinesh Kanaba, as you already know, is a regular at this conference, and he will take over as the panel leader, and we'll have a discussion of about 40 minutes or so and discuss some of these key trends with a greater focus on international tax developments. And to introduce Yvette, before she starts her presentation, let me just quickly give you an outline in terms of a bio. Yvette is a senior associate for Sub-Saharan Africa in the IBFD Africa and Middle East Department. She has tax technical editorial responsibility for publications in the Sub-Saharan Africa region. As a tax specialist in a number of countries in the region. Part of the team which organizes the annual Africa Tax Symposium of the IBFD. And she's also involved in various tax research studies and projects in Africa, and a regular speaker and trainer in various international tax topics. Prior to IBFD, she has worked at BDO East Africa as a senior tax advisor. And before I let Yvette start her presentation, I have to introduce the panel leader, Dinesh Kanaba. He's stalwart of the industry, decades of experience, top tax advisors, among the top tax advisors in India. And he has been in various leadership positions, as many of you will know, across several large professional service organizations in India, including KPMG, RSM, Pricewaterhouse, and so on. He's a National Executive Committee member of FICCI and has also worked with the Government of India on several policy committees and a director of various boards in the corporate world. And without further ado, I would like to now call upon Yvette to make her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Firinda, fellow panelists, and our dear guests. You're welcome, and I am very happy to be with you today. In the last 100 years, the international tax regime has been characterized by mainly 4 elements. That is the sharing of taxing rights between source and residence countries on active and passive income through treaty negotiations. Double taxation elimination, which is done unilaterally by jurisdictions or through tax treaties. Profit allocation to entities in a global value chain based on the arm's length principle. And finally, and most recently, tax transparency through exchange of information. However, trends or businesses for which these elements were designed have changed over time. There has been a significant shift in technological developments and business models due to globalization, digitalization, and global mobility. It is now difficult to tell borders and thus knowing what is source, what is resident. In the early 80s, the internet was launched. It has evolved through a number of stages. That is Web 1.0, which was a more decentralized kind of platform, a read-only, where people would upload information for consumers to consume. Then we moved to Web 2.0, as many of us know it, one that was characterized by intermediaries that come between the user, big tech companies, platforms, social media platforms, and all that. It was more centralized, but it was a read and write. Us users could create our own content and everything. And now there's a new paradigm shift in the internet where people are taking back, they are reinventing the internet and taking back ownership, taking away the power from the platforms, the big tech companies, and Web 3.0 promises that where people take back ownership of the internet, and it introduces a distributive technology called the blockchain. Recently, I watched a movie called BlackBerry. I hope most of you have watched it. It's a new movie. It explores the incredible growth and tragic collapse of BlackBerry, the first smartphone company. But there's a phrase which caught my eye. When they were marketing the BlackBerry, the marketing person was like, we want to introduce a future where people no longer go to a city for meetings. We want to be able to have meetings online. We want to be able to, for a person in Toronto, to meet with someone in Bali. And that's what they were marketing as the BlackBerry. And that time, the BlackBerry was introducing a feature on the phone, which was exchange of emails. As technology has come growing through BlackBerry to where we are now, different generations, as we can see, all of us here belong to one of these generations. We all adopt these new technologies differently. I am a millennial, and studies show that millennials, the older millennials, are the ones who are the last ones to sign up to Facebook. The Generation Z doesn't understand it. That way of interaction is not for them. There are more studies show that the Generation Z prefer to stay indoors and interact more with their friends online, but not the Facebook way that we knew it. So in 2021, Mark Zuckerberg announced the launch of the metaverse. I watched the video and I was thinking to myself, oh, that is not for me. And what was he promising? He was promising a new way that we look at the internet. BlackBerry promised that we shall meet and in meetings from wherever we are. But now, what does the metaverse bring to us? We have a number of seats here that and have not yet been filled, maybe because there's traffic jam. So what does the metaverse propose? People could have joined us here using hologram. So we would have seats filled by hologram figures here. Or better still, we would all decide to wear our virtual glasses and go into the metaverse and interact together, and we are all there regardless of where anyone is. That is what the future looks like. So the metaverse is really a future of how we are going to experience the internet, I have just mentioned. And then Web 3.0 is really a decentralized kind of technology that uses distributive infrastructure, which is called the blockchain. So in this picture, I would like to, the first row up, I would like to show you what the Generation Z or the younger people really are into now that is taking us away from what Web 2.0 as we knew it. So in the first picture where we see Fortnite, that is Travis Scott having a show in Fortnite, which can be watched by anyone in the world who is a Fortnite person. Justin Bieber did a show during COVID, the Super Bowl, and then Roblox, a game many teenagers are playing nowadays, which can also be paid for. They can play to win. And now, also looking at what Zuckerberg presented to us, we have the lower layers, and that is the future, what metaverse looks like. If we are going to use avatars in the metaverse, we as human beings like to look nice, dress well. So even in the metaverse, you can decide what your avatar is going to appear like in a meeting. You're in your bed, but so you can buy things like shoes, designer bags. We have the sandbox where you can buy real estate property, buildings, and everything. And then this is a Teams that put a Teams meeting. So the future of the Teams meeting, as I said, because right now we have what we call hybrid working. And at my company where I work, we have not fully gone back to the office. You can go to the office if you want, but there's some people I haven't seen since 2019 because they can really work from home. So what is the new technology promising us? Those people can join us in meetings, in Teams meetings, via avatar. They can come, we meet together. Then there are immersive experiences. It's my first time in India, but I could have come to India through an immersive experience, go visit the Taj Mahal. It doesn't give you the physical experience, but that's what is happening. And people have bought onto it. So, in terms of tax issues, what tax issues does this present that tax authorities, us as practitioners, I mentioned earlier that we are all from different generations. Unfortunately for us tax practitioners, even when we choose not to use the metaverse for what it's for, we have to find out how it's going to change the taxation paradigm. So first, if it's in case of tax treaties, if we are to tax treaties, for example, in terms of the metaverse, there are things we can look at. For example, where is the payer or purchaser located? For example, the market jurisdiction. And if we decide to look at that's where Pillar 1 comes in, because Pillar 1 is mainly allocating taxing rights to taxing jurisdiction, but all other aspects can be considered, like where is the seller, where is the metaverse owner located, where is the technology infrastructure located, or even the vendor, seller of the NFTs, non-fungible tokens. Those are digital assets that are exchanged within the blockchain that have a unique feature. So all those things really play a role in how we formulate policies around these things. Mentioning NFTs, I said, one, they're unique tokens. Things that I showed that you can buy property, land, shoes, bags. They would all have a value. So how do we tax such transactions? For example, I've mentioned the word unique, which can introduce things like intellectual property. Are there royalty payments? There is real estate being bought in the metaverse. Are we going to charge real estate tax on that? As our domestic laws define that. So those are all the challenges that we as tax practitioners are faced with in the nearest future. Then, just before the pandemic, of course, as the digital world keeps evolving, we had already had so much working from home going on. But then the pandemic merely cemented it, and now it's like a thing. So it's also important to look at how mobility of individuals is going to affect taxation in the next 100 years. Because what we have as discussions today is fixed so much around business income. But the rate at which, as individuals, we are traversing the world is also a thing to take note of. Because in most of the developed world, but also in developing countries, personal income taxes, first of all, they're easy to collect and they contribute a very large amount to tax revenue. So when they get affected, it's affecting developing countries mainly in terms of making revenue to achieve the sustainable development goals. So there are things to consider. Studies show that people who are moving the most are senior members in companies, mainly tech companies, or very skilled workers. They want to be free, mainly because they're working from home, free to be in Bermuda and you're working for a US company. But that has some effects in terms of transfer pricing, profit allocation. Because transfer pricing, as we know it, when we do the functional analysis, we always look at the decision-making staff. Where are they based? So now we have a situation where staff are moving all over the world, and that might have an effect on profit allocation rules, raising very many transfer pricing issues. Secondly, taxable presence threshold can be met through this kind of work and mobility. Considering Article 5 of the OECD and UN models, fixed place of business. So the homes, so for example, one of these employees has a beach house in another country where he's decided to work. If we look at all the elements of Article 5.1, would they create a PE for the company? And then dependent agent also, if whatever they do, wherever they are, because they're decision-making staff, they can easily create a dependent agent PE for that. But also for less skilled staff or decision-making staff, there are so many other tax implications or things that can traverse that need to be considered. So like nowadays there's been a change. Some employers would choose to classify employees differently, independent contractors or employees. We need to find the tax jurisdiction if there's a lot of movement. Of course, deduction of home and other work-related expenses. So those are all the things that we need to consider. But also, I've mentioned technology and how it's thriving. There is an issue of AI, and I'm sure all of us here have reached a point and asked ourselves, is my job safe? Because you just put into ChatGPT, please advise me on Uganda's tax system, and it will bring a whole. So tax authorities also have to plan for that future of staff who are going to be affected in future by the emergence of AI, who are going to be on the losing end of technology, who are not going to have any income, and yet the governments have to provide for them. That's also another thing. Then, justification for climate change and taxation, still in relation to individuals. There's so many eventualities that have been mentioned that can happen because of climate change. And these can also lead to more movement of individuals. For example, if a country's the global warming or like one of eventualities of climate change, if not curbed, if environmental taxes are not introduced, can affect workers who cannot work in the city anymore because of too much pollution, and that will also have adverse effects on taxation and revenues. So, and then that brings us to climate change again. So, climate change has been a topic advocated for by many. And the biggest advocates often argue that there is a double dividend to be had in raising revenue from taxing for environmental taxes. And the double dividend based on the fact that, one, we raise revenue, and two, we when you raise revenue from climate change, then you can subsidize other taxes in other places, but also combat the effects of climate change. But that's not the most important thing, because climate environmental taxes are not meant to be a revenue-raising avenue for a long time. And probably that's why most governments have ignored them. But they're supposed to mainly combat, reduce pollution, reduce all those negative effects on society that are affecting us, that might have effects in future. So it's important for governments to really consider. I think very many countries have environmental taxes, cigarette taxes, plastic bags, and everything. There is the cross-border adjustment mechanism, like the EU emissions trading system, that also developing countries can consider to see that the adverse effects of climate change do not affect work as we know it. And that brings us to the work by the OECD and the UN in relation to the emerging trends that I have just discussed. So, Pillar 1, as we know it, is meant to allocate taxing rights to marketing jurisdictions. And recently, in October 2023, the Inclusive Frameworks Task Force for Digital Economy released the text for the MLC. However, it hasn't yet been opened for signature, but when it does, it will only be ratified if 13 countries deposit their instruments of ratification, and the keyword is "and." The deposit of these instruments ratification represents a total of 600 points and more. So the points are included in the annex of the MLC, and the US has 486 points, which means that the US plays a pivotal role in if Pillar 1 comes to light. Pillar 2, I will not go much into it because of the sessions that will cover it, but it's meant to have a minimum tax so that companies don't pay less tax than they should. So the OECD gave us the 2-pillar solution as a package. As we are now, most countries are implementing global minimum tax elements, but Pillar 1, as it stands, is not moving forward. So, Pillar 2 solution is called "It's Fixed the Challenges of a Digital Economy." And Pillar 1 was the one that was supposed to focus on the digital economy. So, what happens if Pillar 1 Amount A fails? Does that mean that the OECD has failed in finding a solution to taxing the digital economy? So, of course, there have been talks mainly from the developing world of the inclusiveness of the OECD. And these are some of the issues that we see with Pillar 1. First of all, most developing countries feel that there was limited allocation of taxing rights. As my co-panelists will point out, that first, first of all, the companies are few that will be taxed, which means it's also going to benefit just a certain few countries, but also some big audit firms. And it's not really achieving the goal of raising revenue for those countries. That then, of course, there's an imbalance in taxing rights, and yet countries are required to repeal DSTs. DSTs, of course, would capture more money for countries, mainly in the developing world. But of course, we know the flaws that are with DSTs. What I have mentioned, the elements or the business models as we know them now, the metaverse, which cuts across, which has made borders porous. It is very hard for us to have a DST and lock it to one border. So we have a global problem that needs a multilateral solution, but we're not coming to that consensus. So is that the time for us to give up our DSTs now, or hold on to them further until when we have a consensus? And the Amount B has been welcomed by most of the developing countries. And of course, Pillar 2, the challenges with it and the rules as they flow, people feel like that most of the revenue will go to residence states. And that is still not being inclusive. And then, of course, it impacts tax treaties, which many of us from developing countries feel is kind of leverage that we have to be able to attract many of the multinationals in our jurisdictions. Of course, and then the dispute resolution complexities that cause so much uncertainty to the taxpayer. And in relation to the UN, it has also had parallel work going on that, of course, is aimed at fighting or presenting the needs of developing countries. And we have seen that in all the proposals of the UN, there are some kind of provisions that are highly put in treaties. For example, shared taxing rights for royalties. Then the inclusion of supervisory activities for PE, construction PE, and then the technical services PE, which is widely adopted. It's in almost over 80% of India's treaties, and recently we did a study on West African countries, and in 27% of the West African countries, Article 12A, you'll find in there. And Ghana, which has almost 50% in its treaties. Yeah, and then what we have not seen in many of our treaties is Article 12B, of course, which is also meant to be a solution to the problem of the digital economy. For example, Ghana has very recently negotiated treaties as late as 2023, because we would say that it's mainly because there's no MLI yet to be able to put this in treaties. But maybe because the UN model is mainly for developed countries, maybe they're strong-armed in not putting it in there, or it's still a wait-and-see approach of what really happens in terms of coming to a consensus on how to tax revenues from the digital economy. Yes, and finally, what has been mentioned by Dr. Firinda in regarding international tax framework. Recently, a statement was signed by a big number of countries asking that the UN opens up an international tax committee. And with those few words, the panel will go through what this means in terms of the future of international tax framework. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
You will all agree with me that that was a very wide spectrum of presentation which Yvette presented, and which was, thank you so much. I think it came across very well, and we're looking at a breadth of subjects, whether it is we are talking about the global nomad or UN versus OECD, which are the two things. How do we move forward? There was this discussion in the morning, and I agree that there is a lot of agreement and a lot of room to converge on both the sides. But before we begin the panel discussion, let me first do a brief introduction of the two panel members who have not yet been introduced. Let me begin with Mr. Rashmi Ranjan Das. I think there's scarcely anybody in this audience who would not know him, because he has been with the Revenue Service for more than 30 years, huge amount of experience on international tax, policy making, implementation of policy. More important, he has been India's lead negotiator in the BEPS inclusive framework and is a member of its steering group. So as a member of that steering group, he has an inside view of what discussions are happening. He's also a member of the UN Committee of Experts on the International Tax Cooperation. He holds a postgraduate degree in public policy and management from IIM Bangalore, a postgraduate degree in international relations from JNU. He has authored a number of papers and is frequently speaking at variety of seminars. What Mr. Rashmi Ranjan Das mentioned to me, and which is of course trite and goes with axiomatic to say, is that whatever views he is talking today are his own personal views as an academician, as what he has seen, not necessarily official views of the government of India at all, and therefore is not speaking in a representative capacity, but more as a personal capacity, and we should just be very, very conscious of that. We then have Annette Ogotu, professor in tax law in the Department of Taxation and at the African Institute in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Her field of specialization obviously is international tax law. She is an author of the groundbreaking book, base erosion and profit shifting are a subject which of course is dear to all of us and what we are going to discuss today. And she has authored a blueprint for Africa's response. She is a research fellow at the Center of Studies in the African Taxation, housed at the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation. She is a member of UN high-level panel on international fiscal accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. She has served as a president of the board of directors of the South African Institute of Tax Professionals, is a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, the Institute of Austrian and International Tax Law at Vienna. And just the sheer composition of the panel out here indicates the emergence of global South. Mukesh earlier spoke about how India led the G20 discussions this year, and the very fact that the composition, I said, really shows how the emergence of South is sort of, and the views are being more and more recognized. And I was talking to Mr. Raspi Ranjan Das earlier yesterday and today. And for a lot of things that we are going to discuss today, and one which I'm going to seek views of many of the panel members, for India, it is sort of a deja vu. When I remember when the CBDT came out with a draft paper on attribution of profits to permanent establishment, there was sort of an uproar to say, oh, India is trying to tax profits without there being a permanent establishment. And lo and behold, we have seen what's happening on Pillar 1 and the issues which are emerging there. When India introduced digital taxation equalization levy again, there was a sort of an uproar to come back and say that the ink has not even dried on action item 1. There's a lot of work to be done there. OECD is shortly going to come back and talk about how digital rights will be taxed, allocated between nations, etc. And what was the need for India to rush? And lo and behold, we saw a lot of European countries do that. And today, almost 8 years after 2015, we still haven't seen a consensus on Pillar 1 and taxation and allocation of taxation of digital rights. So we're seeing quite a few things where India has taken lead and sort of which is coming back. Okay, I was talking earlier, and we'll have a panel discussion of important part on 12A and 12B, Article 12A and 12B. India has been one of the leaders in talking about sort of fees for technical services. We incorporated it into our domestic law way back in 76. Seen number of changes out there, number of case laws out there, and the world again seems to be moving towards that. So India has seen quite a few things which emerged out there, and we are going to have a discussion around many of those things. So what I'm going to be doing really, and for me it's very easy part, it's really putting questions to the panel members, is for them to respond to that. Before that, if I can first invite Annette Ogo to give a brief sort of overview, some initial going in thoughts, and then if I could invite you, sir, to come and give some few initial thoughts, and then we'll set up a stage for question answer. If any of the audience members would like to ask any questions, do we have a TP, any thing buddy going around with chits or whatever, we can just collect and look at the questions and whatever else. So Annette, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction to be here. I'm glad to be once again in India and to be on this panel. It's such a pleasure. Just tracking the international developments over 100 years, as Yvette has just said. Developing countries, by the time these rules were developed, developing countries at large were besieged during that time. And now we're talking about the times of World War I, World War II. They were being besieged by the ills of colonization, and there wasn't much input from developing countries, apart from your Mexico draft towards the development of model tax treaties, where they were pushing for source taxation. But that was obviously watered down by the London draft. And then developing countries pushed for the UN to come up with a UN model. And over time, we see that the work of the UN model in championing the cause of developing countries was pushed on, but with not too much oomph, as we see has been done with the UN. And so we see the global financial crisis, but even before then, there was the concerns about allocating of proper allocation of taxing rights. Global financial crisis comes in, and now the residence countries find themselves in a position of being in a source kind of position, and they develop the political will to develop and make sure that the rules are updated so that they are protected. So over the years, we have seen the voice of developing countries becoming stronger with the OECD inclusive framework. And lo and behold, we see the voices of, for example, the African Tax Administration Forum pushing the boundaries, no more sitting down to take it as it is, but pushing the boundaries. And we are seeing changes that were never there before in terms of how the rules are being developed. And then now we also see how the African countries have come in very strongly in terms of the development and calling for that UN UN resolution that we're going to talk about regarding promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation. So I'll stop there now and
Thank you. Let me also first start by thanking IBFT and FIT for this opportunity to share my thoughts. And as Mr. Kanavar has so helpfully said, whatever I say here are my personal views and do not necessarily represent the views of the Government of India or United Nations Tax Committee. Now, Yvette has made a very nice presentation and others have also given their thoughts. I will just put what I'm looking at evolving trends in international taxation. Little bit, very briefly, on the procedural level, I think most of us will agree that there is almost an agreement or rather recognition among countries that we need multilateralism. We need a multilateral solution because in the globalized, digitalized economy, you cannot have bilateral solutions or you cannot have unilateral solutions. That we have seen in the BEPS 1, which evolved further to inclusive framework. Now, hopefully, it will, now is evolving into the United Nations. And along with that, as Professor just remarked, there will be regional organizations like ETA, and we have a Latin American platform coming up. So that is the trend you will see, multilateralism, trying to find out multilateral solutions. The second, along with that, the multilateralism doesn't mean only having signing treaties. It can also have a system of a soft law, international tax, international tax, like say Pillar 2, a best approach type, which of course subsequently we can have discussion about, subsequent discussions can go about what Yvette was referring to, how to tax metaverse or the crypto, because here this is not about taxation of countries or allocation of rights. It's finding out what is the best way to approach taxation. On the substantive level, I think something which is important, I personally feel, is that there is going to be less and less tolerance of low taxed income. I think we have moved from a stage till 2008 when we talked of elimination of double taxation. Then we moved into BEPS 1 where we talked of eliminating, ensuring that there is no double non-taxation. Now we are talking of ensuring a minimum taxation. And that is something is going to happen. And adventurous tax planning, aggressive tax planning will be gradually and increasingly frowned upon now. The second thing which of course have been touched upon is that the rules which were framed in 1920s are no longer fit for purpose. The P as a proxy doesn't work, particularly in a world where world trade now consists of a substantial part of services, cross-border services, and the ALP doesn't work. I think there is enough literature. It fails to provide a fair allocation, particularly where the intangibles are there and you don't have an observable location of those intangibles. So we'll have exciting times in international taxation, and it's the best of the times to be in the field. I think in the next 5 years, we may see transformative changes which you have not seen even in the last 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And with that, if I can plunge into the questions, and maybe I could begin with you, sir. You mentioned about attribution of profits and how that has become not, how arm's length principle has become not relevant. And if I could just go back for a minute on the CBDT draft paper I mentioned earlier, how it sort of evoked an uproar. How do you see the emergence of arm's length principle going forward? How do we see attribution rules going forward?
Thank you for that question. I think, as I said, you earlier referred to India. I think I take pride in the fact that my predecessors in the revenue, in the administration, and also, I think we're talking of Professor Rotigi today and several of you. I think because of both the professionals and Indian government, we have, in a sense, I mean, it's a little bit of thought leadership in the taxation. you talk of equalization levy. I'll give an example of 2018 interim report. In the interim report, there was no agreement among countries that the markets can have a right to taxes. And we were the only country who said that we cannot agree to this report, and therefore there was a footnote in 2018, footnote number 1, in the chapter which says India doesn't agree that India says that markets must have a right on their own. And within that, think of 2018 to 2021 when this we had the Pillar 1, which effectively accepts that markets per se have a taxing rights. Now, going forward, as you said, I think India's that report, which was placed in the public domain, about profit attribution to PE, something I would believe we are moving in that direction. Pillar 1 is going in somewhat in that direction, and recently I co-authored a paper with Professor Sol and several of my colleagues of UN Tax Committee, which we said that possibly that may be a better method, because now that the technical design from the Pillar 1 is there in already there in terms of having the say M&E as a group and having a tax base and everything. So I think we'll have increasingly more formulary type things coming up.
Thank you. And whilst we are looking at all of that, and you're talking about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, how do you look at the fate of Pillar 1? Yvette in her presentation spoke about, and there was a specific mention in her slides, that if we are unable to address the issue of digital taxation, a sort of OECD would have failed in our approach. With USA still sitting out, we don't know where it is going. Consultations probably happening next year. The lack of consensus, the way Republicans are looking at this entire thing. How do you see the fate of Pillar 1?
The fate of Pillar 1, maybe let's take a step back and get all of us on board as to where we are right now, because it's a critical, pivotal moment that we are in as an international tax community. On the 11th of October 2023, obviously the OECD released the Matlato Convention on Amount A of Pillar 1, which is intended to coordinate the allocation of taxing rights of Amount A for market jurisdictions. And we've been talking about this whole Pillar 1 issue and Pillar 2 for the last couple of years. Now, the Matlato Convention requires a critical mass of jurisdiction to sign it by the end of 2023, with the object of having it enter into force in 2025. The critical mass, as Yvette has already said, requires signature of 30 states, which account for at least 60% of states in which they are headquarters of multinationals, which fall within the scope of Amount A. And now we are talking about multinationals that have revenues exceeding over 20 billion euros and a profitability of greater than 10%. These are the world's largest and profitable multinationals, and they are headquartered in the US, European countries, in China, and in Japan. If the required critical mass of jurisdictions is achieved by the end of 2030, it was agreed by inclusive framework countries, actually, back in July 2023, that they would stop DSTs, and this will be, that the stoppage of DSTs would be extended until 31 December 2024, or the entry into force of the Matlato instrument. Obtaining a critical mass, as you've asked, hinges a lot on the US, which accounts for 46% of in-scope multinationals, which amounts to 486 allocation points out of the 600 required for the Matlato Convention to enter into force. If the US is not on board by 31 December 2023, then the likelihood of the stoppage of DSTs to expire and unilateral measures to be put to an end is kind of in balance. Several countries, including the US, have indicated that they need to have discussions at domestic level, which will include public engagement, parliamentary approval, before they can sign on to this Matlato instrument. In fact, on 11th October 2023, the US Treasury Secretary issued a public consultation document, and it refers to the Matlato Convention as a draft convention. And it raised concern that the full text of the convention had not yet released. So the public should come on board and provide comments regarding the novel ideas that are in the instrument, how it will be implemented, how it will be administered, and how it will impact on US multinationals who are concerned that the DST is actually discriminatory to the US multinationals. Now, the call for public input ends on 11th December 2023. The likelihood of that ending before the end of December is high, and I can see these discussions moving on into 2023. And obviously, it is almost unlikely that US parliamentarians will be able to agree to this. A number of emerging economies, including you in India, Colombia, Brazil, have also included reservations to the Mar-a-Lago Convention, expressing concerns about the marketing and distribution safe harbor, which has got implications for Amount B, including the treatment of withholding taxes and the concerns that there will be less taxes that are given to source countries. In the Netherlands, also there, the Dutch Secretary of State informed the Senate House of Representatives about what Pillar 1, Pillar 2 is. They're showing interest in it, but also concerns as to whether actually this will pull off. And they raised the concern that if at some point there is no longer a clear view of the global agreement, they say that alternatives should be sought. And in their view, they would have preferred a lack of proliferation of DSTs, but if that fails, maybe they'll fall back to their 2018 proposal of a European DST, I don't know. But where things start now, we literally are standing in limbo. The envisaged Amount A proposal, if it doesn't happen, means that the international tax system will be quite unstable. But if we throw a spanner into the whole discussion, who is this actually benefiting? Is it benefiting the US? If it pulls out, what next? Because like we say, they've been concerned about DSTs and their impact on them. We saw them slapping trade tariffs on France and so forth. And back in 2021, we saw an agreement between US, Austria, the UK, and France about stopping DSTs and the US stopping those retaliatory tariffs on them. So if this stops and the US doesn't sign, there will be more proliferation of DSTs, which the US doesn't like. So we are all watching and seeing what Big Brother is going to do while the international community is on a standstill. Thank you.
So, if and pardon me for putting it in a stark way, should we say RIP Pillar 1?
Maybe.
Okay. So, if I could come to you, the countries which have come back to say that they would like to implement Pillar 2 only if Pillar 1 is also sort of given effect to. So, with whatever we are hearing on Pillar 1, what is the likely sort of overshadowing on Pillar 2, and where do you see this entire framework going?
No, I think, as you correctly said, many countries views Pillar 1, Pillar 2 as a package. It was, in fact, presented as a package both in July and October 2021. But Pillar 2 is something which doesn't require any change in international tax treaties. Therefore, some countries are moving on with that. And therefore, once you have a little bit of widespread income inclusion rule, then it will capture the profits if they are not taxed in the source countries. Therefore, countries will be moving, therefore, either to raise minimum taxes or to find out what is happening to the tax incentives. So, Pillar 2 can have an effect where if major countries which host multinationals do it, then others have to respond. They cannot simply sit quiet.
And therefore, do you also see a digital tax be really the logical outcome as we go ahead on Pillar 1?
No, I think so far as countries which have digital taxes, they have committed that they will withdraw it if there is a Pillar 1 agreement. So till the Pillar 1 happens, digital taxes, of course, will continue. And then, of course, other things like the standstill, which is expiring 2023, I think countries will, of course, have to.
You mentioned about taxation of metaverse. And in some sense, we are not even seeming to be ready for digital taxation. I mean, action item 1, 2015, 2023. And now we are talking about metaverse and the challenges that poses. Do you really see how will all of this be moving forward?
Well, first of all, tax is always a step behind development. So the metaverse is here, whether we like it or not. And then now it's up to, because if we look at the rules as they are now, and that's what I was mentioning, because we have to look at where the income is actually sourced. Because if we have now music shows taking place in the US, but everyone else is attending them as an avatar, the income is sourced all over the world. And there's so much that needs to be looked at, the source of the income. And really, we are behind. We are one step behind the developers in the technology world, but it's not something we can ignore because it's here and something has to be done. So pillar one would be a good solution to it, because the metaverse is one of the very big companies, like the tech companies that are providing, that are one of the big ones, which might be capped in the 100 companies, but still.
Yeah, but yet if pillar one is not there, we will come with a digital taxation and find a way to. So more and more, I see the move towards indirect taxes as opposed to sort of something which is within the treaty network. But one of the things which I thought was quite important, you mentioned, sir, about multilateralism. And in a strange way, I am seeing pillar one and pillar two being negative on that. And let me tell you why I say this. So I look at one country, for example, which has imbibed pillar two, which was a tax-free jurisdiction, which is the UAE, and which has now introduced taxes. Same thing. Bahrain is looking at, etc., etc. So here are a set of countries which were regarded as tax paradise. They wanted to get out of FATF. They wanted to imbibe pillar two, and they introduce a 9% domestic tax. And then you have a 15% tax, and that percentage has not been named, to say as and when pillar two gets implemented, we'll look at pillar two and the rate of tax applicable to MNEs. And as we help several companies out there in UAE, we find a very strange thing. So companies which are operating within and outside of UAE, but whose footprint in the UAE is say 90%, just 10% is outside of UAE, simply because they are now classified as a multinational, they will be taxed on the entirety of profits of 15%. And here are companies coming back to say that why are we paying this extra 6% tax on our domestic income, and therefore is the government creating a disincentive for being global multinational? Should we not really stay local? And in the light of that sort of, and we have seen this happen all over, any thoughts that you would like to talk about on the Samsung Vietnam controversy, where Vietnam has come back to say that we are Korea has come back to say that we are going to permit Samsung not to be taxed at a higher rate or find a way to subsidize whatever they are paying?
Okay, I'll come in there on the Samsung issue. But perhaps just a step back again. When the OECD issued Pillar 2 Global Minimum Tax, it indicated that it was to prevent harmful tax competition and shield developing countries, your Vietnam now, from the pressure of offering ineffective tax incentives so that they can mobilize taxes better. And Vietnam is one example of a country that is seated with this quagmire that many developing countries find themselves in, despite the advantages of what Pillar 2 may bring. So we have South Korea's Samsung that earns quite some big revenue out of its many factories in Vietnam that assemble smart phones there. Vietnam's corporate tax is actually set at around 20%. But over the years, it has offered various low tax, effective tax rates to large foreign investors, the likes of Samsung, and offers tax incentives, your research and development incentives. And it's recorded that back in 2022, Samsung actually paid as little as 5.1% on the tax it owes in one of Vietnam's provinces where it operates. In November 2023, Vietnam decided to adopt the Pillar 2 rules, which would increase the effective tax rate on multinationals such as Samsung to the 15%, the global minimum tax by 1 January 2024. But the Korean Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam said that members were concerned about the new tax, and tax experts have also warned in Vietnam that they could see a drop in foreign investment if the country did not do something about it and offered maybe an alternative to buffer the increase in taxes. Vietnam relies heavily on foreign direct investment, just as is the case in many developing countries. So there are fears that this new rule could make Vietnam less attractive to multinationals. And so the government has indicated that it will come up with a compensation plan whereby companies with large investments in Vietnam, such as you, Samsung, will receive an after-tax handout or refundable tax credits to support their manufacturing or research work that is done in Vietnam. Now that puts this country, which has decided to come up with these global rules on 1 January 2024 in a quagmire, because the lawmakers now have got to sit and wonder how are they going to bring these initiatives of compensating multinationals in line with the OECD global rules. So that's where many developing countries are finding a problem. At dinner yesterday, we had a discussion of how this plays out for developing countries. I mean, they had tax incentives. We all have whatever we have to say about ineffectiveness of tax incentive in encouraging foreign direct investment. But what about the foreign exemptions that are given to multinationals in higher developed countries, and the tit for tat that happens with respect to that? So that's the challenge of many developing countries. Many of them have got stabilization clauses in the treaties that they have signed, bilateral investment treaties, most favored nation clauses that impact on how they are going to deal with the issue of Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and the Vietnam example is one that is highlighting the challenge.
So we see that as a, please go ahead.
No, I just a couple of comments. One is, I personally feel this is the right time from developing countries to dump the false narrative that incentives bring foreign investment. They don't. Because if a business is profitable before tax, it doesn't need incentive. And if it is not, it should not be encouraged to have that unproductive investment. They come not because of tax, but because of other things. They were going to Vietnam because of its a low cost of the labor and all. The second thing about designing this compensation, I think countries must be aware that there are enough anti-abuse rules in the Pillar 2 itself, which may derecognize their domestic minimum tax or QDMTT if there is a direct connection between that tax and a compensation that will be paid to the MNEs. So I don't think it's that easy. I think we need to fight. We need to fight and ensure that a misalignment between the profits where they are reported and the economic activities where they occur. In fact, as per the last report, which was issued by OECD last month, 30% of the profits are reported in jurisdictions which hold only 4% of the employees. And this is not something which should be tolerable and which I think will change over the period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very interesting perspective. Thank you so much. Please do come.
Yes, but the issues regarding tax incentives and the fact that many, for example, African countries are levying taxes way beyond 20%. And if the minimum tax for Pillar 2 is at 15%, that has been a concern. And there was a call for it to become higher. So Pillar 2, despite the advantages it brings, the concerns about tax incentives that you raise, is another pain in developing countries. Now, with Pillar 1 having the issues it has as to whether the OECD will, the US will sign off or not, I want to come back to the question you raised about will countries actually want to continue with this whole two-pillar approach? Mm-hmm. If you raise the question about Pillar 2 being, finalized before Pillar 1. From the onset, the OECD indicated that Pillar 2 is supposed to work as a backstop to Pillar 1. So the political dynamics there, I think, are issues that we really should not ignore. And it played out back in 2021 when the EU came up with the draft directive on Pillar 2 model rules. Right there on 12 April 2021, Poland actually vetoed the implementation of the EU draft directive, with the Polish Secretary of State reasoning that Pillar 2 had to be implemented before Pillar 1. And it is an explicit link to, because it is clearly linked to Pillar 1, and Pillar 1 is the main piece of the two-pillar solution. The French Minister of Finance noted that it's not possible for the two of them to be that connected. There is no enforceable link between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. But the Polish Secretary of State actually asserted that Polish companies should not be subjected to global minimum tax of Pillar 2 without ensuring that large digital companies are fully taxed under the profit reallocation rules under Pillar 1. Obviously, we know that on 15 October 2022, the Council of Europe reached unanimous agreement to implement the EU minimum directive on Pillar 2. But these are political innuendos that are already lingering, having been raised by Poland, and many developing countries are concerned about them. So if Pillar 1 becomes very fluid, what's the likelihood that countries will stand up and say, let's ditch Pillar 2 also? I'm just raising it.
That was a question which I had put really, that if Pillar 1 is not on the cards, what happens to Pillar 2? Thank you so much for answering that. Let's move to the next point. And Professor Singh, if I can invite you to come over here. So we're looking at carbon tax. And Yvette mentioned this in her presentation. As we talk today, the Dubai COP is going on, and our Prime Minister has invited in 28 COP 33 to be held in India, etc. And there is this huge amount of proposition with the developing countries, including India, has been putting on the table, that when Europe introduces a carbon tax, it is actually nothing but a form of trade protectionism. It really is not a tax at all. If there was a carbon situation that was evolved by the developed countries, and they are now sort of wanting the developing countries to pay cost of that, and again, to borrow Annette's proposition, is becoming a political issue. Any thoughts, any comments that you would have?
Yes, just quick thing about this is that when you look at climate change, I would go back to look at how does it impact your respective countries, and then you look at a solution that would fit your respective countries. Unfortunately, across borders, you're beginning to see a situation where even when you export to a particular country, you are then, your rights are impinged because you have to comply with certain things that the developed world wants to impose. So the challenge is that when you look at carbon tax, if you look at country by country analysis, the issue is really about why would I want to introduce a carbon tax? Is because I want to cut down pollution. I want to find the polluter. But you also have to realize that the developed world has a long way to go before they can impose that, because it impinges the economy. It takes a lot more time to perhaps adjust, arrange and modify your processes. But so some countries, a carbon tax, a very low carbon tax is the starting point. And then slowly you look at how the country develops. But you cannot impose a high carbon tax immediately, because you know very well that the traders are unable, the businesses are unable to switch quickly. So I think, to me, at the end of the day, carbon tax is simply one of many options. There are other types of taxes that you can impose. There's also the issue of encouraging electric vehicles, and what do you do? What incentives do you introduce? Perhaps you could look at that. There are many, many options, but I don't see the world imposing a particular formula for every country to impose. That's going to be a true burden for everyone. So I do, the question that Dinesh had here, disguised step towards protectionism, the jury is still out, but I think there is this feeling that that's what is happening.
Thank you. So let's move as we go ahead towards the last 10 minutes of this session. And we're talking about the UN approach versus the OECD approach. We are talking about Pillar 1 not going anywhere. We are talking about Article 12A, Article 12B. As I mentioned earlier, again, India has sort of a deja vu. We always had in almost all our treaties the equivalent of Article 12A on fees for technical services, and we are now talking about a 12B, a digital tax, etc. Um, and I think it's a question for all the panel members. So, yet, why don't we begin with you? How do you see the UN approach versus the OECD approach? Where do you see Article 12A, 12B leading, and is that a better approach rather than Pillar 1, and which is sort of seems to be going nowhere?
First of all, the UN approach, where they really advocate for more revenue being allocated to developing countries, is a good one. But my issue with Article 12B would be that the treaties do not impose tax. So domestically, how are we taxing this income for Article 12B to actually apply?
Agreed.
And probably that's why to date we have not had anyone put in their treaties, because we are still not sure where the GSTs lie, which could actually be taxed through Article 12B or allocated right. So that is, for me, that is the issue.
Yeah, but in a sense, if I may just come in for a moment, 12A has been there on domestic legislation, say for example in India, and therefore in all the treaties, and therefore again there's this question about definitions, domestic definition versus treaty definition, but leaving all of that aside, it's been there. But it's a matter of time that if we accept 12B to be the way forward, that domestic legislation will again imbibe it, and then it will become sort of a way again, whether a multilateral instrument again is needed to impose 12B. Any thoughts there?
But I think Adet will correct me if I'm wrong. 12B has been there since 2021, and probably there would be some kind of signs that show that domestically this is what we are doing, and this is how it can relate to the treaties. So, in my opinion, that is where my confusion comes from. So,
please.
Thank you. I think I will come back to what Evita said, but on UN, I think it's not, I don't see it's UN versus OECD. You can see both of them so close friends, Hakim and Michael Leonard. What is the good thing about UN is we have all, most of us have seen the screen where it showed who voted for what. And that is, I think, the strength of UN. It's democratic and it's transparent decision-making process. Now, why people are going to UN, why those 125 countries have supported UN? Because it's an expression of discomfort with the present state of affairs. And what will happen in UN and what is not happening in inclusive framework? I think if you look at the resolution, it is the MDGs didn't have tax, but SDG, I don't want to foreshadow what Michael is going to say, but in UN, the tax will be seen in a context for development, including for the gender, for looking at developing countries to help them to their sustainable development goals, which was not there in the OECD discussions. I think it's my disappointment, Akim is there, that after 2021, October statement, every rule that inclusive framework has approved has reduced the pie to be distributed under Pillar 1. Not a single rule has expanded that pie. And that is necessary to look at. The developing countries need more resources. That's why we need something, hopefully, both the OECD and UN can cooperate in the process. I don't think it's a OECD versus UN thing. Coming back to 12B, I think, in a sense, all the digital service taxes and equalization levies are somewhat 12B type. So there are models available. You spoke of 12A. I think that there are two ways you do it. I mean, whether the treaty practice gets crystallized, that happened in 12A, and a 12B will be, I think there's a treaty now, you have domestic law, it may be extended. So I think it's a question of time. Countries will, if there is a multilateral solution, hopefully there will be there one, or countries will go ahead. They will be having some sort of 12B. I think I was told that 2 countries have signed a treaty with 12B in. I think there was a South Center letter to that effect, but it's 2 years is not enough time in the lifetime to change treaties. I think it's just...
Yeah, that's the only comment I would make on 12B versus digital service taxes, that indirect tax versus bringing something into the treaty framework and therefore becoming creditable, which I think is very, very critical, because today we are seeing something which is totally outside the treaty network.
But nothing prevents countries from giving credit
I
to
agree.
this.
But unilaterally, nobody has done that so far. So your thoughts, Annette, on that?
I think for me, this is just a political game that is going on. Where are we where we are right now? It's all about struggling for revenues for these multinationals. And the fight is between the US trying to actually prevent the EU and all other big nations from taxing their multinationals beyond what should be taxed. And so we talk about this discriminatory approach. And then we go into all this roller coaster ride of having to develop pillar one, pillar two. We appreciate the effort that is put in, brought everybody together. But now we are at the point with all the resources spent. So what next? Then the UN comes up with a simplified approach. Guys, why can't we use the treaty approach? We've been there, done that, seen what withholding taxes can do. Yes, they are a pain, but at least for developing countries, they are actually quite simplified, and the approach is there. But obviously, anything that is being presented from a development perspective will a developing country will face that, hesitation and whatever from developed countries. And so we have where we are now. It's all about taxing automated digital services. It's lesser in scope than the pillar one approach, which also has what consumer saving facing businesses. But essentially, what we are doing is the same. And the issue is, why don't we do it via the treaties? Maybe we can bring our heads together, do it much more better, and make it work, other than the approach which we have taken that is very complicated. Even the US mentioned in that report that it sent out, the discussion draft, that the system is just so complicated.
You wanted to comment on that, David?
I guess I would have a question for Annette, because what you mentioned is right, and I would advocate for DSTs right now as the situation is with Pillar 1 and everything. But the issue still lingers. How do we allocate income to these countries for them to be able to tax these digital services so that they can be treaty rules can apply to them? Because that also seems like the big thing with the new business models, how they are designed, of user participation. Like, you cannot really place a user somewhere, and that's what the challenge is. Mainly for developing countries, we don't have the technology or the power to be able to get those incomes and know that they're
But
sourced
it is
within our
happening in any
jurisdiction.
event through the unilateral mechanism of digital service tax, in any case today. So the fact that we have to find that mechanism, I would totally agree with you. I think the broader question is whether that mechanism is something which countries can agree to as a part of a framework, because we have not been able to find through the two-pillar solution. But I'm sure that's a debate which can continue. Let me come to the last point, again, just in the interest of time. So you began, Professor Singh, and he spoke about, or rather, Justice Shikri spoke about in his talk about one world, one tax. And that seems to be just a concept, a dream, at least at this point of time. But let me come to the 2 points I have put out there. How do you see litigation? Because at the end of the day, in 2015, I remember very, very distinctly that it was supposed to be putting an end to global tax litigation. We seem to be getting more and more into a quagmire rather than deeper rooted in that litigation rather than come out of it. Annette, any comments there? And then Professor and Mr. Das, thereafter, any comments from you? On how do you see litigation going forward?
We haven't. I think the challenges we have with the lack of certainty right now in the international tax rules that we have come up with. The challenge we have is that we have new rules that have got implications on domestic rules, and they're being layered on top of the current tax treaty network that we have. With the old way of doing things, we had your usual map for treaty issues, and we had also the court system to deal with domestic issues. But now with the multilateral instrument, for example, to deal with BEPS-related matters, with the new multilateral instruments that are coming in with their own interpretation of how they should be resolved, we have layers upon layers. God only knows when this does settle, how are we going to deal with these issues? And it is a pretty concern, it's an acceptable concern for multinationals, for everyone, as to how these things should be resolved. It's a concern under BEPS 1 that actually when it comes to resolving treaty issues, it has been relegated to MAP and competent authorities to resolve. In my view, I think that was one of the things that I felt shouldn't be a decision that was made with respect to Article 4.3, that everything should be relegated to competent authorities, because it's just going to open up a can of worms without clear guidelines. And actually, it reverts back to you consider place of effective management and everything else. I think it should have been given a second step, not the first priority in terms of resolving. Then we have the challenges of putting a lot of focus on binding mandatory arbitration, which has been a major concern for developing countries due to their lack of experience, tax sovereignty issues, lack of clear rules on how arbitrators are appointed, the secrecy of, we can go on and on about their concerns. But then now they're saying we will have elective arbitration for developing countries, for example, with respect to Amount B and so forth. So one wonders, where are we going with these issues? It's like different layers of how to resolve issues. Uncertainty is still remaining a concern. I appreciate what Michael said regarding mediation and conciliation as some of the measures maybe we should consider to resolve.
Some last comments from you?
Thank you. I think just a brief one on the concept of UN or the one tax. I think there we need to find balance. In macroeconomic classes, we were saying we are talking about impossible trinity between inflation, interest, and foreign exchange rate. You cannot control three of them together. Similarly, here one need to take a balance in one world, one tax or a UN world tax thing. How broad-based you want it? How many countries you want all countries there? Then how ambitious you can be, how deep you can go for the taxing rights, and or you just touch the top of the things where you have more consensus. Third, how you make it more enforceable. So these three parameters will play out, which I think my colleague Mike Hudson recently wrote very nicely on after the UN thing came up. Now coming back to litigation, I think everybody agrees that litigation doesn't help, neither the tax administration nor the tax payer. And one thing I find that if we can stop little bit of adventurism in tax planning and tax audit, it will reduce litigation substantially. Actually, the adventurism in tax planning and restructuring and new structures coming up, those are the real cause of most litigation that we see. And the second, if we can simplify the international tax rules, I think, which hopefully one of the purpose of the UN thing is, and I think what Professor referred to, if you have simple low-level withholding taxes, those are very simple to administer. Just to give an example, in Pillar 2, countries are struggling to read Pillar 2 to find out the accounting rules of which apply to the country of the ultimate parent entity, and they will struggle to audit it. And I found a comment somewhere that you don't have to audit it. Let the developed country audit it. You will be happy with that. I think that's not an approach which developing countries will like. They have to outsource their tax audit functions to developed countries where MNEs are there. So to the extent we can make the rules simple, that will help.
Thank you. We could have gone on this session, but we earlier had a felicitation of Professor Rohatgi, and one of the things which he had put as a part of this conference was you begin and end on time. So we are 3-4 minutes overrunning, but I thought no, that's beyond the
okay.
So let me put this way. We heard a variety of views out here. We are seeing the political ideology, as Professor Annette put it on the table, and rightly so. The elephant in the room, which is the US thing out, and we seem to be not heading towards any global consensus sooner rather than later. And I think the point to which Rashmi Ranjan Das went on putting all the way through is that aggressive tax planning is something which needs to be given a go by. That's something which is going to surely lead to litigation, and that's something which none of us want. The final word on sort of global compliance costs, they are just mounting. If you ask any tax head of a global multinational, it began with the master file, the CBCR, and now with everything else happening, it's just going to go on increasing as a cost of global compliance, and we are getting more towards automation and everything else rather than really being able to look at affairs in a holistic manner. So with that, we would end the panel discussion, and if I can hand over back to you, Professor Singh, for your final comments.
Thank you. And I just want to echo what Dinesh has said, that in terms of the items, the topics that we have just discussed, it leaves us with a lot of ongoing matters that we need to think about and mull over as likely policy options wherever we are, whether it's the OECD, whether the UN or any other organization. I think it highlights the fact that we need a robust international governance framework that can unify all international bodies handling tax policy matters. It's like a big brother that is coming in with an international framework. Who is going to police this international framework? So the issues are dispute resolution. And therefore, this concept that I alluded to when I introduced this, opened this session, this issue is, do we need, therefore, a World Tax Organization which can enforce this particular international framework that we want to do? And at the end of the day, compliance costs are mounting up. So the question is, what is the whole objective? Can we make it simpler? So I go back to this issue about simplification. That seems to have been thrown away, and we are all living in a world of complexity. But I hope taxation can become simpler. And I'm looking at the representatives from the OECD and the UN, and perhaps that can be something that we can look at in terms of making things easier for everyone. And I also do believe that one of the things that has come out of this Pillar 2 concept is the thousands of pages that have come out being introduced. How many of us in the room have actually read it? And I always say tongue-in-cheek that this seems to be an enrichment plan for the big four accounting firms. And they are the ones who have jumped on board. All the other practitioners can't do this because they don't handle the large multinationals. But in conclusion, we also have a situation where it's going to be a two-tier system. The larger multinationals, you are subject to this particular 15% global minimum tax. The smaller multinationals who don't fall within the framework can continue to enjoy incentives. And that may well be how it's going to evolve. But then again, creates complexity. And we want a level playing field. How do we reach that? That's the end goal I think we want to try. And with that, I thank the panel members for their valuable time and comments. And I'm sure the topics here will resonate again in the subsequent sessions. It's work in progress. We hope we've given you food for thought. And with that, I would like to pass it over to the MC for us to go to the all-important lunch that we all are waiting for. Thank you.